In 1912, in the state of Virginia, a man named Joseph Carter folded a newspaper and stared at the word Titanic as if it were a name spoken too loudly in church. He had crossed an ocean once and survived what many men with finer coats did not. Yet for 83 years, he told no one how. Joseph was not known for loudness. He learned early that silence could be armor. On the great ship, while others laughed and drank and argued about class and fortune, Joseph watched doors, listened to footsteps, and memorized the tone of authority. He understood something most did not. That survival often belongs to those who wait, who observe, who endure without demanding to be seen. When the ship went down, history recorded numbers. It did not record glances. It did not record who was told to step back or who was never invited forward. And Joseph carried those unrecorded moments home to America, where silence, once again, was safer than truth. In the spring of 1912, Joseph Carter boarded the Titanic not as a dreamer chasing grandeur, but as a man practiced in restraint. For Joseph, travel had never been about comfort or spectacle. It was about passage. Moving from one place to another without drawing attention, without inviting scrutiny. In the United States of his lifetime, silence was not merely a habit, but a learned survival skill. Long before he ever saw the ship, Joseph understood that being seen too clearly could be dangerous. As he approached the Titanic, Joseph felt the familiar weight of observation. Eyes lingered on him a moment too long, measuring his clothes, his posture, his right to be present. No words were spoken aloud, yet much was communicated. The ship itself was a marvel of steel and ambition, but Joseph sensed that it was also a floating reflection of the world he already knew. A place carefully ordered, where every man had an unspoken position. He knew better than to challenge that order openly. Instead, he studied it. Joseph carried little with him. A modest case, neatly packed, and the discipline of patience. He did not hurry across the gangway. He did not stare in wonder as others did. He noted details, the direction of corridors, the location of stairwells, the way certain doors were guarded more closely than others. Intelligence, for Joseph, had never meant education alone, it meant awareness. He listened to how officers spoke to passengers of different classes. He noticed whose questions were answered quickly and whose were met with tight smiles or silence. Among the laughter and celebration, Joseph remained reserved, not because he lacked feeling, but because he understood timing. His quiet was often mistaken for obedience, and he allowed that misunderstanding to stand. Silence gave him freedom others did not realize they were surrendering. While men argued loudly about privilege and progress, Joseph observed how easily confidence blinded them. The Titanic promised certainty. Joseph trusted no such promise. What made Joseph's presence on the ship remarkable was not that he was the only black man aboard, but that he understood what that meant before events proved it true. He did not expect fairness from the sea or from men. Instead, he prepared himself inwardly, steadying his thoughts, conserving his energy, watching the rhythms of the ship as one might watch the tide. This first turning point establishes Joseph not as a hero of action, but as a figure of endurance. His silence is not weakness. It is intention. He enters the story already carrying the tools that will later save him: patience, attention, and the ability to remain unseen without disappearing entirely. The world around him believes strength announces itself. Joseph knows better. He boards the Titanic knowing that survival often belongs to those who speak last, or not at all. As the Titanic settled into its steady course across the Atlantic in 1912, Joseph Carter allowed himself to fade into the rhythm of the ship. Days passed with the soft thrum of engines beneath polished floors, and nights arrived with music drifting down corridors like perfume. To many aboard, the voyage felt suspended from ordinary life, as if the world beyond the ocean no longer applied. Joseph knew better. He had learned that comfort often dulled perception, and he refused to let the ship's grandeur soften his awareness. Joseph became a quiet student of human behavior. He observed not with suspicion, but with precision. He noticed how authority moved, never loudly, never hurriedly, but with expectation. Officers did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Their confidence rested in the certainty that they would be obeyed. Joseph recognized this tone well. It was the same tone he had heard from clerks, conductors, and overseers throughout his life in America. The setting was new, but the language of power was familiar. He watched how people were separated without chains or walls. Certain doors were passed freely by some, and carefully avoided by others. Instructions were given differently depending on who stood before the speaker. When questions were asked by well-dressed men, answers came full and patient. When asked by those considered lesser, replies shortened or vanished altogether. No cruelty announced itself. It lived instead in omission, in what was left unsaid, in who was expected to already know their place. Joseph remembered faces. He remembered gestures. He took note of staircases that curved upward into brightness and others that descended into narrowness and shadow. He memorized the ship's habits as one might memorize a town's unwritten rules. To survive any place, Joseph believed, one must understand its order before that order collapses. At meals and gatherings, Joseph remained polite, careful not to linger where he was merely tolerated. He listened to conversations about safety and progress, about the triumph of modern engineering. Men spoke of the Titanic as if it were immune to consequence. Joseph heard something else in their certainty, a refusal to imagine failure. That refusal unsettled him more than the sea itself. What Joseph carried with him, more than fear or doubt, was memory. Memory sharpened his instincts. He recalled past moments when calm voices preceded sudden change, when reassurances dissolved without warning. He understood that disasters rarely arrive shouting. They come quietly, wrapped in confidence. This turning point deepens Joseph's role as a witness rather than a participant. His strength lies not in what he does, but in what he sees and retains. While others surrender their awareness to comfort, Joseph preserves his. His eyes become a record that history will later neglect, but which his mind refuses to release. On the Titanic, observation is not idle, it is preparation, and Joseph, though unrecognized, is already preparing for a night that will test every unspoken rule he has learned to read. The night the Titanic met the ice did not begin with panic. It began with quiet, too much of it. In April 1912, the sea lay smooth as polished glass, and the cold pressed gently against the ship like a held breath. Joseph Carter noticed the stillness before anything else. He had lived long enough to know that silence could signal safety or danger, depending on who controlled it. When the ship shuddered, it was not the violent strike many later imagined. It was a hesitation, a subtle wrongness that traveled through the deck beneath Joseph's feet. Around him voices rose in confusion, but they were restrained, careful not to alarm. Orders were spoken calmly. Reassurances followed quickly. The machinery of authority moved into place, intent on preserving order above truth. Joseph did not rush. He had learned that sudden movement drew attention, and attention, in moments like this, invited judgment. He listened first. He watched the faces of crew members as they passed, how some avoided eye contact, how others spoke too evenly. He understood then that this was not an inconvenience, but a reckoning delayed by politeness. As instructions began circulating, Joseph noticed who was guided forward and who was told to wait. No harsh words were used. No force was needed. People obeyed because they trusted the structure that had always protected them. Joseph had never been protected by such structures. That difference mattered now. He positioned himself carefully, choosing spaces where he would not be questioned, where his presence would not require explanation. He remembered the ship's layout, the stairwells he had studied, the doors he had counted, the corridors that narrowed without warning. He moved only when movement was necessary, pausing when the crowd thickened, letting impatience reveal itself in others. The cold grew sharper. The deck slanted just enough to unsettle balance. Still, Joseph waited. He watched lifeboats fill unevenly, noticed how hesitation was mistaken for compliance. When spoken to, he answered softly, briefly, without argument. He had learned long ago that survival was not always granted to the strongest voice, but often to the calmest presence. What saved Joseph was not luck, nor favor, nor courage as stories like to define it. It was timing. He understood when to step forward and when to remain unseen. He did not demand space, he accepted what was offered and prepared for what was not. In the end, he found himself lowered toward the dark water not as a chosen man, but as one who had endured long enough to be overlooked. The sea that night was merciless, but it was honest. It did not pretend equality. It took without regard. Joseph survived not because the world suddenly became fair, but because he never expected it to be. This moment marks the core of the story, survival achieved through patience, awareness, and restraint. On a ship built on certainty, Joseph lived by caution. And when certainty failed, caution remained. After the Titanic sank and Joseph Carter returned to American soil, the world did not pause to recognize the quiet endurance that had kept him alive. He stepped off a ship that had promised grandeur, only to find that survival in a society structured by prejudice offered no applause. From 1912 onward, America presented him with a different sort of sea. A slow, invisible current of expectation and dismissal. To live as a black man who had survived the greatest maritime disaster of the age was to inhabit a space of invisibility, where memory could not easily claim voice. Joseph's days were ordinary on the surface. He walked streets lined with brick and gaslight, past storefronts that refused him entry or measured it carefully, and returned each evening to modest lodgings. Yet beneath the surface of this quiet life, he carried an ocean of recollection. He remembered the ship's corridors, the silent calculations of who would be saved, the subtle signs that marked the living from the doomed. Those memories were both burden and armor. Speaking them aloud risked disbelief, ridicule, or worse, erasure. People did not expect the testimony of a man like Joseph to matter. History, he learned, often ignored those who did not fit neatly into its pages. Letters and interviews occasionally approached him. Scholars, journalists, and the curious asked questions about the Titanic, about what had happened in the cold Atlantic night. Joseph replied sparingly, with civility. He did not boast, he did not exaggerate. He offered only fragments, glimpses that hinted at the truth. Many dismissed them, not out of malice but out of habit. The culture of his country had a rigid script for who could be a witness and whose voice could shape history. Joseph's story was never intended to fit that script. Through decades, Joseph's silence became deliberate. It was no longer merely a survival tactic, but a conscious choice. To speak prematurely was to invite intrusion into a life he had fought to secure. Friends came and went, unaware of the private archive of observation he carried. Time passed, and the world around him changed slowly, leaving much of its old prejudice intact. Yet Joseph endured. Patience, once a tool for survival on the Titanic, became a life strategy. Endurance through invisibility, a quiet resistance to erasure, a living testament preserved in thought alone. By the late 20th century, Joseph's body had aged, his steps slowed, and his voice had gained the weight of decades. The quiet he had maintained for over 80 years was no longer dictated solely by fear or necessity. It was shaped by the knowledge that the truth of survival, carefully observed and preserved, had value, but only if it could finally be spoken without interference. In this long quiet, Joseph learned that resilience could be measured not only in the endurance of the body, but in the patience of memory, the strength to bear truth alone, and the courage to wait until the world could finally listen. In this chapter of his life, survival became a quiet, living act, a sustained observation of time itself. America's long quiet tested him, but it did not break him. Instead, it tempered the memory he carried, preparing him for the moment when silence would finally give way to speech. In the end, Joseph's patience was a bridge between what had been witnessed and what must finally be known. By 1995, Joseph Carter was a man whose body had long learned the weight of quiet. His hands, once steady on the railings of the Titanic, now trembled slightly with age, and the careful poise that had guided him through perilous waters remained, though softened by time. He had spent 83 years carrying the memory of that night, a ledger of glances, pauses, and unspoken choices that no ledger elsewhere recorded. And now, nearing the end of his own life, Joseph felt the need to speak, not for recognition, nor for proof, but simply to release the burden of memory that had defined him. In the modest room where he chose to speak, the walls seemed to lean closer, listening. Joseph spoke slowly, each word deliberate, as though he were folding it neatly before setting it down. He told of the quiet authority of the officers, the subtle deference demanded of some passengers, and the silent panic that crept into corridors unmarked by sound. He spoke of the small acts of patience that had kept him alive, knowing when to step aside, when to remain still, when to blend into shadows. The story he told was not one of heroics, nor of luck. It was one of observation, endurance, and a steady mind that refused to be hurried by circumstance. Those who heard him were struck not by the content alone, but by the weight it carried. Joseph's recollections were meticulous, yet they lingered in the space between the words. The long silences that framed his sentences. They were the silences he had known on deck, the pauses when fear had risen but motion had not yet been commanded, the quiet that had allowed him to survive when others could not. Memory, Joseph understood, was itself a kind of survival. To remember was to honor the choices had preserved life against overwhelming odds. As he continued, he allowed his mind to wander through the echoes of the past. Faces that had looked past him, hands that had extended and withdrawn, steps that faltered in panic. These were all etched in his memory. The world had changed, yet the past remained unaltered. He spoke softly, allowing the details to fall like small stones into the vast, dark sea of recollection, each one landing with a quiet splash. When he finished, Joseph sat in silence. No applause followed, no confirmation of truth was demanded. It was enough that he had remembered aloud, that the ledger of eyes, doors, and timing he had carried alone was finally acknowledged, if only in that small, sunlit room. And though the words had been spoken, the memory of survival remained, lingering in the quiet spaces where history rarely notices, but endurance quietly persists. In that stillness, Joseph understood that to survive is not merely to live. It is to carry the past with a mind unbroken, a soul tempered by patience, and a silence that, once broken, resounds with its own haunting truth. Joseph's story, like the gentle sway of the Atlantic long ago, drifted into quiet reflection. The sea, the ship, and the night remained in him, an unbroken line of observation and endurance that could not be erased. Memory, he knew, is a life kept alive in the silence of the mind, and in that silence, survival endures, unseen but unwavering. Dis feel I am here. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by historical contexts, and is not presented as a verified historical account.